Now today we're reading the last two verses of 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. For they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come. I've mentioned Jimmy McClements, my mentor, before in these little talks. Those of you who knew him will remember that Jimmy was full of stories about the Belfast shipyard. If I remember the name correctly, he used to tell us about a wee man called Dougie Edwards, who came from a very rough background. After Dougie got saved, there was such a change in his life that it spoke to his work colleagues with a louder voice than anything he ever said to them. I think that there could have been something similar with many of the Thessalonians. Yes, they did sound out the gospel, verse 8 tells us, and personal testimony is what we should all be engaged in. But these verses seem to emphasize the real effect that salvation had upon their lives. For example, in verse 3 we read about their work, labour and patience. And then in verse 6 we read about they became followers of the Lord. And then in verse 7 we read they were ensamples to all that believe. The idea in ensample is that they were model Christians. When we come to verse 9 where we've read, Paul writes that they turned to God from idols. It was a complete transformation. It's often been pointed out that they turned from and they turned to. In Luke 11, the Lord Jesus explained in the words, when the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places seeking rest, and finding none, he saith, I will return. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. The problem was that the man had only carried out the first and not the second of those injunctions. Salvation not only turns a person away from sin, but it turns them to Christ. The possibility is that we can describe our Christian faith in terms of what we don't do, rather than in terms of the blessings into which we have been brought. These Thessalonians were known for having something that was really worth having. The story is told of a young man giving out tracts with a very glum expression on his face. He offered a tract to one man who declined it with the words, no thanks, son, I've enough problems of my own. Maybe I should express a little more of the joy of the Lord in my witness. After all, we serve the living and true God, verse 9. That is something worth smiling about. Not only did the Thessalonians demonstrate the reality of true conversion here and now, but they had the hope of the Lord's coming before them for the future. They were, as verse 10 tells us, waiting for his Son from heaven. This is another word that's only found here once in the New Testament, and it conveys the idea of patient or confident waiting, not the way one waits for a bus that might or might not turn up, but with expectancy and anticipation. Perhaps the Thessalonians could teach us another lesson. They had given up the world and its idols and understood that their interests were in heaven, and they anticipated them in the Lord's coming. Tomorrow we'll consider what Paul writes about pleasing God.